Good afternoon. So let me just talk to you today about why do companies employ graduates? It's an interesting question because many employers use this as a massive hurdle for individuals to join their workforce. Sadly, I have to admit that I was a graduate trainee 30 years ago. I wish it was a much shorter time frame. But when I was hired, about 25% of young people would be going to university. It was considered to be something where you would become independent, you would have courses that had academic rigor, or you would be going to a vocational program. And so companies were hiring graduates as a differentiator. What's happening today is that the hurdle rate seems to have spread out to a much larger population. So more people have to be a graduate in order to get onto that first rung of the employment ladder. In order to differentiate yourself now, you have to go into even higher qualifications. So do employers really need to hire graduates? Do they really need graduate qualifications and that academic rigor in order for someone to do a job? So this is the question that I'm posing today. The other interesting issue that exists for us is that there are 71 million young people unemployed. That's an enormous number. What does that unemployment mean and translate into societies around the world? So 40% of companies in a recent survey said that they couldn't find young people with the right skills. It seems strange that 40% of the workforce in the UK have a degree. So we're the most highly educated that we've ever been, and yet companies are saying they can't find people with the right skills. So it's an interesting and difficult problem for us to resolve. OECD countries also have shown that in the last 10 years, there's been a 10% increase in the number of people studying at a tertiary education level. So the original intention of more and more students being able to access a degree qualification was rooted in egalitarianism. It was about giving more people a chance, but I think the outcome is actually a little bit different in what we look at today. So I'm just going to talk to you about a bit of a mismatch here, which is we've got this big unemployment issue with young people. We've got employers saying they don't have enough people. So I'm going to talk to you about Greg. Now, when I was working my first job in a car plant in Essex, we were making 2,000 cars a day. It was my very first job out of university. I went to an all-girls school. I was now in a plant with 10,000 men. The only women in the plant were catering staff and the sewing machinists in the H building. Some of you may have seen the film Made in Dagenham. It was the birthplace of the Equal Pay Act for women. So I didn't really understand that I was working in this iconic place. In my first month, we hired the very first women into production on shift in Dagenham. And can you believe it? It was illegal to employ women on shifts in factories in 1986 in the UK. Illegal. And when the Sex Discrimination Act came in, as a result of years of pioneering work, we were the first out there hiring women into our production line, and it was an amazing moment, September 1986. So I digress. I want to talk to you about Greg. So Greg was one of my apprentices, and I was his training officer. I was a year older than him, and he was one of 50. They were training to be electricians, plumbers, mechanical craftsmen. They were seen as the prestigious jobs in the plant because they had some career prospects. You were more likely to be promoted from the trades. The only problem was that Greg and all his apprentice friends spent 2 days in college to supplement what they were learning in the plant on the job skills. Greg was brilliant in college. He was pretty hopeless in the plant. So there I was, his training officer, trying to guide him through his next stage of his apprenticeship. And so I actually said, Greg, I think you need to go to university and do a degree, because really it's not going to work out for you here in the plant. So of those 50 apprentices, Greg and maybe one other were probably the ones who actually were on the wrong path. So Greg was earning about 75% of a full tradesman's wages, which was quite a lot of money. He was on about the same money as I was as a graduate. That was a lot of money to give up. Greg was living at home with his parents. He drove a cabriolet. He paid no rent, and his mum did his washing. So, interestingly, it was a real push to persuade Greg to give that lifestyle up and go to university. His parents had never known anyone who'd gone to university. They didn't have anyone in their lives, they had no friends, family. So it was a really big mindset shift to even think this was a possibility. So 3 years later, when Greg graduated from Warwick University, he rang me and said he'd got his first job as a graduate engineer. And I felt it was one of the most important stages in my career, actually, because I felt I had an impact on him. But interestingly, what was going on with Greg's apprentice friends at the same time? So here's Greg now on his graduate career path. His 49 friends who are in the car plant, the best of them in that same time would now have been promoted to foreman. They'd be on about the same money. On that career path, his friends would have had access to a pretty good career within the company. They would have been getting skills, they would have been growing as individuals, as managers. So now they're on a dual track, parallel lives, equal opportunity. The challenge that we face today is that I could simply not persuade Greg to go to university now. Why? When he left university, he had £200 or £300 worth of debt, and he cleared that in 6 months. He would have found a house, he would have bought a house, he just started a family. I could not persuade Greg to take on $30,000 US dollar equivalents worth of debt. I simply couldn't persuade his family to take on that. Why? Because the return on that investment is unlikely to happen. He couldn't pay that debt off in 6 months. What kind of job would he have got? If he was ringing me now, he probably would be working in a fast food restaurant or a coffee shop. So the problem we've got is graduates are doing jobs, they're unhappy because they've been qualified to do something else. They're not getting the money that we would have had before with premium wages. They're not paying off their debt, and it's spiraling. This situation is simply getting worse, not better. So one of the issues we've got is the system, the ecosystem of getting qualifications, employers and skills, the education system. This ecosystem somehow is not working for us. So the other issue is the US, we all have heard these statistics. In the last 10 years, student debt has trebled to $1.2 trillion. It's now the second largest consumer debt. So it's an impossible situation to think that you're saddling people with this kind of debt. So why is education now becoming something that only the wealthy can access, or people willing to take on pretty big loans? Not every country in the world is saddling their students with this level of debt. So if you look at countries like Finland, a graduate might come out with $8,000 US worth of debt. If you look at Switzerland and Germany, their youth unemployment is not at 13 or 14%, or at 25% like in France, or at 40+% like it is in Spain. Their numbers are closer to 6.9% in Germany, 3.6% in Switzerland. So why is it that some of these countries seem to be getting it right? Well, I've moved education systems from the UK. I was brought up in the UK, I went to university in the UK. My 3 daughters were born in Hong Kong. I've lived there for 14 years, so I've seen a bit of the Hong Kong system. I've now just moved to Zurich in Switzerland, so I'm now looking at the European system through a different lens. So what is the system, and why is it that it seems to be working better as an ecosystem? What I'm seeing is that there's a twin track on education, and it starts really young. Between 11 and 16, children go one or either way. About 25% of them tend to go on what looks like a graduate track. It's possible to switch over, just like Greg did. And then the other children are going on a more vocational path. At somewhere between 16 and 20, they start to go into employment, where they are on formal training, skills programs, where they can build up their careers and their lives. Parents in Switzerland are delighted when their children go on an apprenticeship, because they think they've got more likely to have a good career and earn good money. They're actually slightly worried when they go on the graduate path, which is an interesting mindset difference. So when you have these dual track systems, you actually find that you're giving more opportunity to more people. But there are lots of interdependencies that have to be right. So also in Switzerland, what you have are companies who pick those kids up out of school, they put them onto those development programs, they supplement them with education outside, and companies like UBS's CEO, a different Greg, Walmart US, these guys were trained by their companies. They're not graduates, they have risen right to the top. They're CEOs of multinational organizations, and they're not graduates. So it's interesting how we put these labels and requirements on people that aren't necessarily adding the value, and we're not necessarily getting the return. So I've had a career of graduates and non-graduates, and I like to evaluate people based on their skills. What do you bring? What are your people skills? So when you look at companies and you ask them, what are you looking for? They're looking for people with some work experience. They're looking for people with people skills who can adapt, who can problem solve, who are creative. And what are the jobs of the future? We often hear about automation, robotization. So there are different jobs going to be here in the future. And through every industrial revolution, the jobs have changed in their nature. So are we preparing our young people for the skills that will be required in the future? There are 7 million healthcare workers short in the world. So we've got an oversupply in some areas, and we've got healthcare undersupplied. Every developed country in the world is going to the Philippines to hire nurses. You know, it's a really interesting thing that governments and countries are creating these dynamics, which is what's the work and what are the jobs and what are the skills do we need in the future? How are we gearing up our young people? And how are we building the necessary skills to fuel our economies in the future? I've got 3 daughters. I had them in Hong Kong. They called me an old geriatric. I didn't even think it was possible to be an old geriatric, but because I had my kids after 40. And when I look at my 3 daughters, they're 12, 11, and 8 years old. They're learning some of these soft skills now, but they're still a bit too young. I can't employ them yet. They're learning how to do 6 thinking hats for problem solving. they do their homework on shared Google Docs. They make iMovies and Musical.lys and Instagrams and network. They have a different skill set already. But I want to make sure that if they're not academically driven, that they have alternatives. I don't want to force them to do something that isn't where their passion is. And I still want them to have a job, a meaningful job with real purpose. So they probably don't want my job because they just seem to think that I do emails a lot. But I think that we in this room, the fact that you're here, means that you care about making a difference for the future. So what's the call to action? Well, it's time, really, for governments and educators to start thinking about the systems that we have in place that will enable our young people to be able to access the right kind of skills and education that's relevant to the world of work in the future. It's important that parents don't feel pressured to send their kids to university just so that they can work in a fast food restaurant and be depressed about that. They need an alternative. Students need to feel that having an apprenticeship is actually giving them a good life and a good career prospect. You know, having come in the last 30 years through manufacturing, when there was coal and steel and car manufacturing going on in the UK, there was more scope for more apprenticeships then. Greg doesn't have a peer group today of apprentices. Unfortunately, those jobs need to be created. Those companies, so the call to action for the companies is to start putting back skills programs with the support of government and education so that we can start to grow the skills of young people into relevant jobs and make sure they have a sense of purpose. It is not good for our planet to have 71 million young people unemployed. It does not help us at all. And in the words of US Labor Secretary, Mr. Perez, apprenticeships are like university without debt. So I'd like to finish that and say, let's create better opportunities for our young people. And thank you for listening.